Did you know that the temperature at which you ferment a wine can have a huge effect on the flavors and aromas that develop during that fermentation? White wine, for example, ferments at a slightly cooler temperature in general than red wine, down at the kind of low 20 degrees Celsius range. Red wine enjoys slightly warmer ferments and can push up to 30 degrees Celsius, but there's a point just above that in the low 30s where the flavors that are being developed during fermentation begin to take on a kind of weird cooked caramelized tone, and generally most winemakers want to avoid that. But carbonic maceration fermentation actually requires temperatures up in that supposed danger zone, sometimes as high as 35 degrees Celsius, just to be able to deliver those explosive heady aromas of pink musk candy, strawberry fruit juice, raspberry sherbet, cherry candy, sometimes even spicier notes of cinnamon and sandalwood. If you perform carbonic fermentation at slightly lower temperatures, you then drastically tone down the effects of all those explosive candy notes that we spoke about, which is not always a bad thing. Say, for example, you have a winemaker who really enjoys the idea of a little bit of musk candy and perhaps some sherbet elements in his wine, but he's really not a fan of the mass crazy bonkers Charlie and the Chocolate Factory type effect. He could then restrain the fermentation temperature of his wine, say down to a hypothetical temperature of 24 degrees Celsius, and the end result would have those candied elements, but would deliver a far more nuanced result. Now we're talking about carbonic maceration because today's hand drink solar wine of the day is the Kottabos Pinotage, which is one of a handful of carbonic maceration or semi-carbonic maceration wines that are garnering quite a lot of attention and really adding some momentum to the conversation around what Pinotage is or what it should be. More important than any debate they may or may not spark, these wines also happen to be delicious. Today's wine is technically not a full carbonic maceration wine because in order to be so, you have to take bunches of grapes, whole bunches, with all berries intact, and place them gently into a fairly shallow fermentation vessel to make sure that none of the grapes have split and that there's no free run juice sloshing around in the bottom of the fermentation vessel. This reason is explained in some other videos that I've made. What you then have to do is seal up that tank, pump it full of CO2, make sure all the oxygen and nitrogen is completely gone, and then wait until the grapes soak up all that CO2, flick over into anaerobic respiration, and trigger all number of wild and wonderful aromas and flavors. Again, I explain the details of those in another video. Now, this is all a huge mission to achieve. Of course, there are some shortcuts that winemakers can take. You could take a plastic bag and put your grapes in there, throw in a little bit of dry ice, and then seal that bag with nothing but a one-way valve to allow oxygen and nitrogen to be pushed out the top. Once the grapes have fermented, technically that would qualify as carbonic maceration. But there's a far more low admin process than even just throwing your grapes in a plastic bag called SEMI-carbonic maceration that manages to produce a bunch of those same aroma compounds without having to go all I am Sam down that crazy candy avenue. Semi-carbonic maceration almost happens by accident in some instances, because really all it involves is taking whole bunches of grapes and placing them into a fairly conventional fermentation vessel. And what happens is the weight of the grapes at the top of the vessel, the ones put in last, crush the grapes at the bottom of the fermentation vessel. And when that happens, the free run juice spills out into the fermentation vessel, and then the native yeasts that are in the fermentation vessel set to work producing alcohol and carbon dioxide from the sugar that they have metabolized. Now, that carbon dioxide, because it's heavier than oxygen and nitrogen, pushes the oxygen and nitrogen out of the container and forms a lovely little envelope of CO2, which can then envelop the whole grapes that haven't been crushed. As I said elsewhere, they absorb CO2, flick over into anaerobic fermentation, and then a whole bunch of chemical reactions ensue, which I explain in videos elsewhere. All you need to know for now is that what you have in the end is a fairly prominent component of carbonic maceration that is taking place by the by, and this occurs alongside conventional fermentation. So the end wine features many of those lovely aromatic candied compounds, but without all the rigmarole of sealed tanks and dry ice. And that is in large part how winemaker Reenen Borman made today's Kottabos Pinotage. Now, when we get into the glass and give this guy a sniff, well, I mean, we may have been expecting a sort of Pinot Noir type affair because that's really very much in vogue with the more progressive members of the Pinotage Brigade, is to make a bright, light, red fruited affair. But that's not what we get. What we get here is something a little different. We get elements that are undeniably ripe, but not in the sort of black sugar plum and blueberry type sense. No, rather it is a ripe candied element. There's black currant fruit pastels in there. There are some plum notes, but then alongside that is some fresh green fennel elements, as well as some stalky, peppery rocket leaf type notes. When we take a sip, well, I think the first thing you might be surprised to notice, given the gentle winemaking, is that the tannins are quite pronounced and quite youthful. I would imagine it probably needs a little bit of time to knock off those rough edges, but there is plenty in there to intrigue you in the immediate. Because alongside those tannins, there are also some fascinating fruit elements that we'll talk about. But really, balance is key in this wine because the tannins are present, but they're not overpowering. And as I said, the fruit is ripe, but it's not flabby. I mean, balance is key. This is Johnny Cash walking the line, even though I know that's not what he meant when he wrote that. And if we're to talk about the fruit notes in particular, there is fresh black plum and there's blackberry elements, and you might go, oh, okay, well, if it's all the black fruit, isn't that icon style? And I'd say no, because generally in those higher alcohol icon pinotages, that black plum or blackberry or blueberry is presented as a kind of heavy velvety blanket in the glass, as opposed to what this is, which is kind of like a light cotton sundress, or at the very least a particularly scanty clerical vestment. I think the lasting impression of this wine is that it manages to combine a sense of youth, but also vibrant fruit, really grippy structure, but enough depth to keep that all in balance. So you have your candy elements, you have your ripe fruit, but the entire fare is fairly light-footed. Not only is it delicious to drink, but I think it'll get a little better in the next 2 to 3 years. But whether you drink it now or later, what's undeniable is that this is another fascinating dynamic to the already fairly multifaceted Pinotage conversation in South Africa. If you enjoyed the video, then support us on Patreon so that we can make more of these videos. And subscribe to the Handling Solo YouTube channel, where we publish at least 6 videos each month talking about things like unusual cultivars, wine science, wine history, unusual winemaking techniques, award-winning winemakers like Reenen Borman that are coming out of the dynamic South African wine.